On April 3rd, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his last speech at an organizing event for Memphis sanitation workers. That speech, often known as "I've been to the Mountaintop," is strangely foreboding. He'll be assassinated the next day, and he almost seems to know it, casting himself in the role of Moses and coming to the verge of tears.
And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
During that same speech, he spends about 4 minutes on the parable we hear today in the Gospel, the one that we usually call the Good Samaritan. It's his last teaching from Scripture.
Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. One day a man came to Jesus. He wanted to raise some questions about some vital matters of life. At points he wanted to trick Jesus and show him that he knew a little more than Jesus knew and throw him off base. Now that question could have easily ended up in a philosophical and theological debate. But Jesus immediately pulled that question from midair and placed it on a dangerous curve between Jerusalem and Jericho. He talked about a certain man who fell among thieves. You remember that Levite? The priest passed by on the other side. They didn't stop to help him. Finally, a man of another race came by. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy, but he got down with an administered first aid and helped the man in need. Jesus ended up saying this was the good man, this was the great man, because he had the capacity to project the eye into the ground, to be concerned about his brother. Now you know we use our imagination a great deal to try to determine why the priest and the Levite didn't stop. At times we say they were busy going to a church meeting, an ecclesiastical gathering, and they had to get on down to Jerusalem so they wouldn't be late for their meeting. At other times, we would speculate that there was a religious law that one who was engaged in religious ceremonial was not to touch a human body 24 hours before the ceremony. And every now and then we begin to wonder whether maybe they were not going down to Jerusalem, down to Jericho, rather, to organize a Jericho Road Improvement Association. That's a possibility. Maybe they felt that it was better to deal with the problem from the causal root rather than to get bogged down with an individual effect. But I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible that those men were afraid. You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road. I remember when Mrs. King and I were first in Jerusalem. We rented a car and drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And as soon as we got on that road, I said to my wife, I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for his power. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive for ambush. You start out in Jerusalem, which is about 1,200 miles, or rather 1,200 feet above sea level. And by the time you get down to Jericho, 15 or 20 minutes later, you're about 2,200 feet below sea level. That's a dangerous road. In the days of Jesus, it came to be known as the bloody pass. You know it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking. And he was acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to seize them over there, lure them there for quick and easy speech. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?
King challenged us and challenges us still to develop what he calls in this speech a dangerous unselfishness. And why is it dangerous? Because he requires us to act not out of our primal fear, out of our sometimes irrational sense of self-preservation, but because it asks us to see the good of others as at least as equally demanding as our own good. You know, the priest and the Levite ask themselves a legitimate question. If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? That's a human question, a question of self-preservation. The Jericho Road was a dangerous place. What if the man was a bait for a trap? Then along comes a Samaritan, and we have to remember that Israelites, the Samaritans, hated each other. This is the absolute last person that the religious authority Jesus is telling the tale to would expect to act righteously. Do you notice that at the end of the parable, that when Jesus asks the authority who acted righteously in the parable, the guy's actually unable to say the Samaritan? He says the one who showed him mercy. But the Samaritan does indeed act righteously. His brain is wired, has come to be wired differently. And he reverses the question, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? The priest and the Levite's brains have become wired to think in terms of fear, while the Samaritan's brain has become wired to think in terms of mercy. This parable speaks directly to us this week. One of the reasons Jesus taught in parables is that they can be looked at from different advantage points. We can be in the person of the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, and even the victim. I don't know about you, but I felt affinity with all these this last week. I've been in a place of fear, a place of compassion, a place of feeling beaten up by one event after another. But the reality is when it comes down to us, most of us sitting in this church are not in the classes of the victims. We're not an American Muslim after the bombing of the tomb of Muhammad in Medina, wondering if the rest of the world will finally accept what they've been saying all along about ISIS being a threat to them as well as Christians. We're not a policeman walking down the street, unable to shake the fear that a domestic terrorist with a high-powered rifle is drawing a bead on them. We're not a person of color, waiting for the policeman to come to their car window, wondering if they will survive this traffic stop. This is a broken world that we live in, but the world was broken when Jesus came into it. I think this morning our best place to imagine ourselves is actually with the religious authority Jesus is telling the parable to. The authority is asking Jesus, who is my neighbor? Sounds like an innocuous question. Who do I have to think of as my equal? Who do I have to treat with respect? Who do I have responsibility for? But of course, the flip side of that, and in some ways what he's really asking is, who do I not have to respect? Who can I have contempt for? Who can I discriminate against? Which prejudices are okay for me to act on? Jesus, who can I legitimately hate? And Jesus doesn't give him a direct answer. He simply tells him a story where the people that the hero respects the most fail to show mercy, while the person he hates the most succeeds, and then challenges him to go and do likewise. Jesus challenges him to develop a dangerous unselfishness. We hear nothing more about this character, this religious lawyer. We don't know if he takes Jesus' teaching to heart or not, and perhaps it's good that we don't, because in some ways, it's as if Jesus is speaking to us today. The voices of hate and fear are loud in our society. We want to know who to blame for our sense of insecurity. Who is our neighbor? Who do we have to treat with respect? And more importantly, who can we act against? Who can we blame for the problems that we all have had a part in? Who can we hate? Who can we ignore on the side of the road? We have a choice on how we treat each other. We have a choice about which set of stories we allow to define who we are as human beings. And which set are we going to choose? There's the set that has the stories about Muslims being extremists who refuse to integrate and are here to destroy everything we treasure. The stories reaching back to antebellum, antebellum times, that men of color are animals and inherently dangerous and violent. There's the stories that police are all power hungry and out to beat up any person of color that they can find. There's the story that the Founding Fathers intended people to have military-grade weapons so that they could individually decide that the government was oppressive and strike out against it at will. And we've seen how every single one of those stories of fear and hate have played themselves out this week, and they all lead to death. Or we can choose dangerous unselfishness, and people do choose this path. After 9/11, Fred Rogers, whom I like to remind people was a Presbyterian minister, said this: "When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news. My mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find helpers who are helping.'" And to this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I'm always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. There are so many people, and we don't always hear these stories, that are examples of the choice of dangerous unselfishness. In this screenshot from CNN, a group of people in Dallas surround a baby stroller with their bodies and rush to get the baby and mother to safety. Or there's this conversation that's been going around Facebook of a young African-American woman telling the story of an encounter with a policeman in a convenience store. She says, "As I got closer, he asked me, 'How was I doing?' And I replied, 'Okay, and you?' And he looked at me with a strange look and asked me, 'How are you really doing?' I looked at him and said, 'I'm tired.' His reply was, 'Me too.' Then he said, 'I guess it's not easy being either of us right now, is it?' I said, 'No, it's not.' Then he hugged me and I cried. I had never seen that man before in my life. I have no idea why he was moved to talk to me. What I do know is that he and I shared a moment this morning that was absolutely beautiful. No judgments, no justifications, just two people sharing a moment." There are two ways we can respond to a week like we've had. We can make the choice of the Levite and the priest. We can keep on walking. We can ignore the reality of suffering, and we can try just to wait for the press to stop talking about this, at least until the next time around. But I don't know if you've noticed, the next time around keeps becoming a shorter and shorter amount of time. Or we can make the second choice, the choice of the Samaritan, the choice of mercy, the choice of dangerous unselfishness. It's not an easy path. It requires us to really listen instead of relying on preconceived notions. It requires us to remain uncomfortable, living with the knowledge that institutions we acknowledge and support and respect are in need of reform. And it requires action, demands of our legislators and government employees. And it requires us to constantly search our hearts and root out all the prejudices that we all have, myself included. On the night before Martin Luther King was assassinated, he said he'd been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land. He told us that he might not get there himself, and beloved, the promised land still lies just beyond our vision. But it is there, and it does not lie beyond God's vision. A land where parents, spouses, and children cry no more for the victims of violence. We can get there, but it will take courage and sacrifice, prayer and action. It will require us to practice dangerous unselfishness. Amen.